The sharp scent of perfume hit me as I walked through the door, but it was the sound of laughter that froze me in my tracks. Still, I didn't say a word, just stood there watching as my wife wiped her tears, her silence louder than any scream. As the laughter from the dining room rang out, I saw him, my son, so carefree, so comfortable with them. The same people who had torn us apart. That's when it hit me. My family wasn't mine anymore. He wasn't my son, not anymore. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. David Carter had never been one to get home early, but today was different. He had wrapped up his work earlier than expected and with no meeting scheduled decided to surprise Maggie. Maybe they could spend a quiet afternoon together. A cup of coffee, a conversation, some time to reconnect. It had been too long since they'd shared something simple like that. As he stepped into the house, the familiar smell of dinner greeted him. Nothing too extravagant, just the smell of something home-cooked. But as he walked into the living room, his eyes immediately locked onto Maggie. She sat there on the couch, shoulders hunched, eyes red. Tears streaked her face, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. David froze in the doorway. This wasn't the woman he had kissed goodbye this morning. This was someone else. Someone unfamiliar, someone vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen in years. His heart pounded in his chest. "Maggie," he said, his voice low, uncertain. She didn't respond at first, as if she hadn't even heard him. The silence between them thickened, the kind of silence that can only happen when a wall has been quietly built over the years, brick by brick. Finally, Maggie wiped her eyes, sniffed, and forced a weak smile. "David, you're home early," she said, her voice flat, hollow, even. David took a step closer, instinctively reaching out, but Maggie recoiled slightly. It wasn't a conscious rejection, but it was enough to make his stomach twist. "What's going on, Maggie?" he asked, his tone softening but with urgency. "What happened? Why are you crying?" She shook her head, a defeated sigh escaping her lips. I don't know how to explain it," she whispered, her voice breaking. But before David could press her further, he heard something from the dining room, laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter that meant joy or celebration. It was the kind of laughter that felt like a punch to the gut. Casual, light, almost mocking in its ease. His body went rigid as he walked cautiously toward the source of the sound, dreading what he might find. He stepped around the corner of the dining room, his eyes darting toward the table. There, sitting comfortably, was Ryan, his son, and beside him Rick and Sandra Thompson, Ryan's in-laws. They were laughing together, laughing, as if there was nothing wrong, as if everything was normal. David's chest tightened. The laughter felt like it was echoing in his skull, pushing him further and further away from the present moment. How had it come to this? How had he gone from a man who worked tirelessly for his family to this, an outsider in his own home? His mind scrambled for answers, but there were none. Only the overwhelming sensation of betrayal. He thought about all the little things, the way Ryan had grown distant over the years, the way he had stopped confiding in him, the increasing number of conversations that felt more like walls than windows. All the signs were there, but somehow David had missed them, or maybe he had chosen to ignore them. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Ryan, what's going on here?" His words felt strained, his anger simmering just below the surface. Ryan didn't even look at him at first. He just kept laughing, his eyes glinting with something David couldn't quite place. Rick and Sandra, of course, didn't seem fazed either. They just continued their conversation as if everything was normal. Maggie stood behind him now, her voice trembling. "David, please do." David turned to her, but she quickly turned away, unable to meet his gaze. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. He wanted answers, but she wasn't ready to give them. Or maybe she was too tired to even try. David's stomach churned as the laughter from the dining room echoed in his ears. It was then that he realized the full weight of what was happening. Years of tension, of distance, of unspoken hurt, everything had come to a head. And now, as he stood there, watching his own son joke around with the people who had increasingly become more of a family to him than David himself. It hit him. His family had fractured in ways he hadn't even understood until now. Maggie's quiet sobs in the living room, the laughter from the dining room, the wall between him and Ryan, it was all too much. A deep, gnawing ache settled in his chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't know what to do. There were no answers, no quick fixes, just the suffocating weight of betrayal and loss. David felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The home he had built, the family he had worked so hard to hold together, seemed to be slipping through his fingers, piece by piece. The question hung in the air, unspoken. Could he ever fix this? And as David stood there, torn between the broken pieces of his family, he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. David sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee mug as he stared out the window. The world outside seemed unchanged, quiet, serene. But inside, everything had shifted. He couldn't escape the image of Maggie crying in the living room, of Ryan laughing in the dining room with his in-laws, as if nothing in their world had ever been broken. The ache in his chest had only deepened since that moment, and he found himself replaying the years leading up to this point. Years of slow, silent deterioration. It wasn't always like this. He remembered when Ryan was young, the way he would look up to him with eyes full of admiration. David had been his hero then. He had been the one Ryan turned to for advice, for comfort, for approval. He could still hear Ryan's voice, small and full of wonder, asking him questions about everything: life, work, love. The days when they'd spent hours in the garage fixing things together, or when Ryan would sit at the kitchen table, eagerly listening to stories of David's childhood. Those were the days that now felt like a distant memory, slipping away with every passing year. But as Ryan grew older, things began to change. David hadn't noticed it at first, those small shifts, those little moments of rebellion that seemed insignificant at the time. It started with the quiet dismissals, Ryan's refusal to look him in the eye, his short answers when David asked about his day, his growing disinterest in spending time with him. The gap between them grew wider, unnoticed at first, then painfully obvious. The respect that once flowed so freely from Ryan had dried up, leaving nothing but an empty space between father and son. David had tried to fill that space with understanding, with patience, but Ryan's indifference only seemed to grow. It wasn't just the way Ryan had stopped looking up to him. It was the way he started looking through him, as if David's words didn't matter, as if his presence was just an inconvenience. Maggie had always tried to make excuses, telling David it was just a phase, that Ryan would come around. But deep down, David could see it. He could feel it. The quiet rejection was real. And what hurt the most was that Ryan didn't even seem to notice the distance. Or worse, maybe he did notice and just didn't care. Maggie's voice broke through his thoughts, low and weary, like she had been carrying the weight of their family's dysfunction alone for far too long. She had been standing in the doorway, watching him, waiting for him to speak, but David didn't know how to begin. The silence stretched on until Maggie stepped forward, sitting at the table beside him. "David," she said softly, her voice trembling just slightly, "I've been trying to hold everything together, but I can't anymore. I don't know how to fix it." David looked at her, his heart aching. He had always known Maggie was strong, but he had never seen her like this before, defeated, fragile, uncertain. She had always been the glue that held the family together, the one who smoothed over the cracks, who soothed the hurt. But now she seemed as lost as he was. "I don't understand, Maggie," he admitted, his voice thick with frustration. "I've tried, God, I've tried, but nothing works. Ryan won't listen to me. It's like he's gone, and I don't even know what happened." Maggie's eyes filled with tears again, and she reached out, taking his hand. "It's not just you, David, it's me too. I'm caught in the middle. I love you, I do, but Ryan is my son. I can't just choose between you both. And I don't know how to stop this distance that's growing between us all." David squeezed her hand, trying to steady himself, but the weight of her words hit him like a punch. He had always felt the emotional distance between him and Ryan, but he hadn't realized how much Maggie had been silently suffering, how much she had been torn between her loyalty to him and her love for their son. She had been bearing the burden of their family's fractures alone, just like he had. He thought back to the moments when Ryan's behavior had started to turn cold. The way Ryan began to rely more on Rick and Sandra, his in-laws, for advice, for validation. At first it was just casual, a conversation here, a joke there. But over time it became more pronounced, Ryan spending more time with them, confiding in them, seeking their approval instead of David's. Rick and Sandra always polite, always there to listen. But it was clear they had begun to subtly fill the void that David had once occupied in Ryan's life. David had tried to address it, but every time he brought it up, Ryan would brush him off, dismiss his concerns with a wave of the hand or a sarcastic remark. He had stopped trying to engage, stopped trying to reach his son. But now, as he sat at the table with Maggie, he realized just how much had been lost, and how little, if anything, he had done to stop it. "I don't know how to fix this," David muttered, his voice raw with anger and grief. "I've tried everything, but every time I get close to reaching him, he pulls away." Maggie leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it's not about fixing it. Maybe it's about just being there for him, letting him come to us." David felt a sharp pang of frustration. He had been there for Ryan, but where had it gotten him? The chasm between them seemed too wide to bridge. He looked at Maggie, the weight of their unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Neither of them knew what the next step was. Neither of them knew if they could even fix what had been broken. But one thing was clear. The family they once had, the family he had fought so hard to keep together, was on the verge of shattering completely. And for the first time, David wondered if there was anything left to save. The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the kitchen table. David had spent the better part of the morning pacing, the weight of the previous day's events still fresh in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Ryan sitting there with Rick and Sandra, laughing, no, mocking his every attempt at connection. It felt like a betrayal, a blow that hit harder than anything he could have anticipated. But today, he was determined. He would talk to Ryan, lay it all out, and finally get the answers he needed. When Ryan walked through the door, looking tired and distant as always, David took a deep breath. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew it had to happen. He couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine, like there wasn't a gaping hole in the middle of their family. "Ryan," David said, trying to steady his voice, but his frustration crept through. "We need to talk." Ryan's eyes flickered briefly in his direction, then quickly shifted to the counter, as if he hadn't heard his father's words at all. David's stomach twisted. This was becoming all too familiar, the avoidance, the indifference. "What about?" Ryan asked, his tone flat, almost dismissive. He opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water and cracked it open, his back to David the whole time. David's pulse quickened. He couldn't let this slide, not anymore. "Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about," he snapped. This distance between us, the way you've been treating me, the way you've shut me out." Ryan paused, the bottle halfway to his lips. He didn't turn around. Instead, he let out a sigh and muttered something under his breath. David couldn't make out the words, but it didn't matter. The apathy in Ryan's voice was more than enough. "I'm not the one with the problem here, Dad," Ryan said, finally facing him, but there was no emotion in his eyes, just coldness. "Maybe you're just too sensitive, huh? Maybe you're reading too much into everything." David's chest tightened. "Sensitive?" His voice cracked, the anger rising like bile in his throat. "You don't get it, do you? It's not just about me. It's about this family, about your mother. We're falling apart, Ryan. You can't even see it." Ryan's face remained unmoved, almost bored. "Well, I don't know what you want me to say, Dad. You think I don't see what's going on. You think I don't feel the tension too." David's frustration exploded. Then why do you keep pushing me away? Why do you keep choosing them over us, over me? His voice grew louder, the raw pain of years of neglect spilling out. Do you think this doesn't hurt your mother too? We've been trying, Ryan, trying so damn hard, but you've been so busy with your in-laws, you've forgotten how to be a son. Ryan flinched slightly, but his expression didn't soften. He set the bottle down with a soft thud on the counter and crossed his arms. Dad, you're just mad because I don't need you like I used to. I've got my own life now. I've got Rick and Sandra. They've been more supportive than you ever have. David recoiled as if slapped. His own son, his flesh and blood, was telling him this. That Rick and Sandra, his in-laws, had been better substitutes than him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. That's the problem, Ryan. David's voice broke, and he felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. You're choosing them. You've been choosing them over us for years, and we're just supposed to sit here and take it. Maggie, who had been standing at the edge of the kitchen, wringing her hands nervously, stepped forward. David, PL. Ease, just let him speak, she said, her voice trembling with the strain of the moment. She looked at Ryan, her eyes full of concern. Ryan, maybe you should hear your father out. Maybe we can. No, Mom, Ryan cut her off sharply, his voice suddenly laced with impatience. I don't need this. I don't need either of you piling this crap on me. He shot a quick glance at David, his expression hard. I'm done with this. You can't keep telling me how to live my life. You don't get it. David's heart sank as he watched Ryan's face harden. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a conversation or an apology. This was the culmination of years of emotional neglect, years of David's attempts to reach his son falling on deaf ears. Maggie's face crumpled, the weight of the situation too much for her to bear. She tried to speak again, but her voice was too small, too uncertain. Please, Ryan, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Don't do this. Don't shut us out. But it was too late. Ryan was already slipping away, emotionally, physically, mentally. The wall between father and son was already too high, too thick, and the more David tried to break it down, the more Ryan fortified it. As Ryan turned toward the door, grabbing his jacket, David felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. It wasn't just that Ryan had rejected him. It was that he had chosen to reject him. And worse, he had sided with Rick and Sandra, the very people who had been subtly encouraging him to push David aside. David stood there, his mind spinning, his heart heavy with the bitter taste of betrayal. What had happened to his son? Where had that young boy gone, the one who used to need him, who used to trust him? He didn't have answers. He didn't even have a way forward. All he had was the crushing reality that the emotional gulf between him and Ryan had become too vast to cross, no matter how hard he tried. The door slammed behind Ryan as he left, and David was left standing there, alone. Maggie's silent tears echoed in the background, the weight of the moment settling like a stone in his chest. What now? Could anything still be salvaged, or was it too late for them? David sat at the kitchen table, his hands clenched around his mug of coffee, the warmth of the cup doing nothing to ease the cold knot in his stomach. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that echoed louder than any argument. Maggie was in the other room, distant, caught in the same emotional limbo. The night before had been another fight, a shouting match, a desperate attempt to reach Ryan, who had simply walked away, slamming the door behind him. David couldn't shake the image of his son's face, so cold and indifferent, as if the family he'd grown up in no longer mattered. He needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't just offer the usual platitudes, someone who might actually understand. He grabbed his phone and dialed Victor's number, knowing that his old friend would offer a different perspective. The phone rang a few times before Victor picked up, his voice warm and familiar even over the line. David, hey, you okay? David exhaled deeply, a mix of anger and exhaustion in his tone. I don't know, Vic, I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm losing everything. Losing Ryan, losing Maggie. Hell, I feel like I'm losing myself." Victor paused, his voice thoughtful. "Sounds like you're at a breaking point." David let out a bitter laugh, a sound that had more pain than humor. "Yeah, that's putting it mildly." Victor was quiet for a moment, and David could almost hear him thinking. "Look, man, it's not just about the way Ryan's been treating you. I get it. He's been distant, disrespectful, and all that. But you gotta ask yourself, what's really going on here?" David's mind spun, the question landing like a weight in his chest. "What do you mean?" Victor's voice was steady, grounding. "It's not just the surface stuff. It's the years of communication breakdown, the years of not really talking, not really listening to each other. The resentment, the neglect, it's been building up. And now it's come to a head." David rubbed his forehead, the tension in his shoulders a constant ache. "I don't know how we got here. I thought we were a family that could make it through anything, you know." "Maybe you thought that," Victor said gently. "But it sounds like Ryan stopped believing it a long time ago. You're seeing the result of years of emotional distance." David stared at his coffee, the truth sinking in slowly. The years he'd spent at work, the times he'd dismissed Ryan's needs in favor of his own, he hadn't realized just how much it had built up. And now it felt like it was too late to fix any of it. "You're saying it's my fault?" David asked, his voice thick with a mix of anger and guilt. Victor didn't hesitate. "I'm not saying it's all on you, but you've got to acknowledge that you played a part. We all do. In situations like this. But that's not the end of it. You need to face the real issue here. Do you think you can still reach Ryan, or has the damage been done? Because if you don't address the real issues, the lack of communication, the emotional neglect, it's not just going to be Ryan you lose. It'll be Maggie too. You need to be honest with yourself about what's been happening, not just what's right in front of you." David's mind raced, his chest tight. Victor was right, of course, but admitting it, truly admitting it, felt like stepping into the abyss. He had always prided himself on being a good father, a good husband. But somewhere along the way, he had allowed his own emotional needs to overshadow those of his family. And now, the wreckage was scattered in front of him. "I don't know what to do, Vic," David muttered, his voice cracking. "I'm trying, but it feels like nothing's working." Victor sighed. "Sometimes you just have to go to the root of it. If you want to fix things, you need to confront it head on. All of it." David hung up the phone, the weight of Victor's words settling deep within him. He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was unavoidable. He had failed to see how deep the divide between him and Ryan had grown, how much of it was his fault. And now, there was only one place left to turn. The next day, David decided to confront Rick and Sandra, the in-laws who had become more of a family to Ryan than he ever had been. They had been subtly encouraging his son's distance from David, validating the emotional rift between them. It was time to face them, to demand answers. If anyone knew what had gone wrong, it was them. David found himself standing in their living room, his palms sweating, his heart racing. Rick and Sandra sat across from him, their expressions unreadable, almost expectant. He could feel the tension crackling in the air. "Rick, Sandra," David started, his voice steady but hard. "We need to talk about Ryan." Sandra gave a small, knowing smile. "Of course, David, what's on your mind?" David's blood ran cold. He had been expecting this calm, dismissive attitude. "I think you know exactly what's going on," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You've been encouraging Ryan to pull away from us, from me, and it's tearing this family apart." Rick's face hardened, his posture shifting as he leaned forward. "David, we're just trying to help Ryan. He's a grown man. He doesn't need to be controlled. Maybe you're the one who's been too hard on him." David's chest tightened. "This isn't about control. This is about a father trying to reach his son, and you, both of you, have made that impossible." Sandra's eyes flickered briefly with something that could have been guilt, but she quickly masked it. "We've done nothing wrong, David. Ryan's a grown man. He makes his own decisions." David's anger flared, his fists clenched. And what about the years of emotional neglect? What about the way you've stood by while Ryan shut me out? You fed into it, encouraged it, and now you sit there acting like you've done nothing. The confrontation escalated from there, words flying fast and bitter, with Rick and Sandra defending Ryan's actions at every turn. They dismissed David's concerns as if they were nothing more than a father's frustration, refusing to acknowledge the real damage they'd helped cause. David left their house feeling more defeated than ever. His heart ached with the weight of it all: his son, his wife, the shattered pieces of his family. What was left to save? Could he still fix this, or was it too late? The door to his family's future seemed to be closing with each passing day, and David was left standing in the dark, wondering if anything could still be mended. David spent the next few days unable to shake the feeling that something was off. The conversation with Rick and Sandra had left a bitter taste in his mouth, a sense of something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just that they had dismissed his concerns. It was the way they had so casually deflected responsibility, as though they had no idea how deeply they had influenced Ryan. But David was beginning to see it. Ryan's behavior wasn't just the result of a rebellious son. It had been carefully shaped by outside forces, by the very people he had once trusted. He started digging. It wasn't like David to play detective, but something about this whole situation felt wrong, too calculated, too coordinated. He began asking questions, casually at first, trying to piece together what had been happening behind closed doors. And the more he asked, the more things began to fall into place. David spoke to a few people who had known Rick and Sandra for years. At first, their answers were vague, but as the conversations progressed, patterns began to emerge. Rick and Sandra, it seemed, had always had strong opinions about family, especially when it came to discipline, respect, and loyalty. But it wasn't just the way they viewed families. It was the way they viewed David. They had quietly undermined David's authority with Ryan, making subtle comments about how a real family should function, how a father should behave. They suggested that David's work-centered attitude and the emotional distance he'd unknowingly created were signs of failure, not just as a father but as a man. They would call it tough love, but what it really amounted to was criticism wrapped in concern. And little by little, Ryan had bought into it. The more Ryan spent time with them, the more he aligned with their values, values that subtly placed David's authority and decisions under scrutiny. David felt his anger rise as he connected the dots. How had he missed this? How had he let these two people, who had once been his friends, so easily poison his son's mind against him? They had given Ryan just enough doubt to create a rift that David had never seen coming. His thoughts were clouded with betrayal. The very people he had welcomed into his life, trusted as extended family, had used their influence to tear his family apart. Maggie, when he brought it up, seemed reluctant to admit what was clear to David. "David, I don't think it's as simple as you're making it," she said, her voice defensive. "They just want what's best for Ryan." David's chest tightened, the frustration seeping through his voice. Best for him, or best for them, they've made it clear where they stand. They've subtly pushed him away from me, Maggie. They've made him question everything we've built. Maggie's face tightened, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. David could tell she was struggling with the truth. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to admit that Rick and Sandra, the people she had welcomed into their home, had been a catalyst in the destruction of her own family. She had always trusted them, relied on them for advice, for support. The thought that they had been manipulating Ryan, feeding him doubts about David, was too painful for her to process. Still, David couldn't back down. He had to know for sure, had to confront Ryan with what he had learned. It was no longer about getting through to his son. It was about exposing the truth. Ryan needed to see the bigger picture, even if it meant pushing him further away. The next time he saw Ryan, David had a new determination in his eyes. He approached his son cautiously, not wanting to escalate things but needing the conversation to happen. "Ryan," he started, his voice low, "we need to talk." Ryan, who had been watching TV, barely looked up. About what? David's heart pounded. He took a deep breath. About what's been going on, about you. And your relationship with your in-laws. You know they've been undermining me, right? You've been letting them get into your head. Ryan's eyes narrowed, the walls immediately going up. What's that supposed to mean? David's voice cracked with frustration. I'm talking about how they've subtly pushed you away from me. They've manipulated you into believing that I'm the problem. They've made you question everything. You know that, don't you? Ryan stood up, his face turning red with anger. Dad, don't you dare try to turn this around on me. You're the one who's always pushing me away, always trying to control me. I'm not a kid anymore. I don't need to be told what to think. David's heart dropped. Ryan, I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to save our relationship. But it's like you've already made up your mind. You've already picked a side, and it's not with us. Ryan shook his head, anger flaring in his eyes. You don't get it. I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's approval. I'm done with you trying to fix everything. I'm done. David's chest tightened, the bitter truth sinking in. This wasn't just a son rejecting a father. This was a son who had been poisoned over time, who had grown so distant that now, no matter how hard David tried, there was no reaching him. Ryan stormed out of the room without another word, and David stood there, a heavy silence swallowing the space between them. He had tried. He had given everything to fix this, to repair the family that had slipped through his fingers like sand. But with each passing moment, it seemed like the walls were only growing higher, the distance between them only widening. He didn't know how much further he could go before he completely lost his son, and with him, any hope of saving what was left of his family. Would Ryan ever come back, or had the damage already been done beyond repair? David didn't have the answers, and with each painful step, it felt more and more like he was losing everything that mattered. David sat in the quiet darkness of the living room, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the letter in front of him. The ink smudged at the edges, but the words were clear enough. It was a tip-off, anonymous but specific. It detailed illegal activities tied to Rick and Sandra Thompson, Ryan's in-laws. David's heart pounded as he read it again. How had he not seen this? The truth was staring him in the face, buried beneath layers of manipulation and deceit. And the worst part, Ryan had been caught up in it without even knowing. David had always trusted Rick and Sandra. They had been family, almost as much a part of his life as Maggie and the kids. But now, everything felt like a lie. The secrets they'd kept hidden, the influence they had over Ryan, it was all starting to unravel in front of him. The walls he had worked so hard to build around his family were crumbling, and there was nothing David could do to stop it. He couldn't keep this to himself, not anymore. Maggie needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. But as he went to find her, a deep, gnawing fear settled in his stomach. What would this mean for their family? What would this mean for Ryan? Maggie was in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She didn't look up as David walked in, but he could tell something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, the same silence that had settled over them in the past few days. It was the silence of things falling apart. Maggie, David began, his voice hoarse. I need to show you something. Maggie glanced up, sensing the urgency in his tone. She set the coffee mug down, her brow furrowing as she looked at him. What's wrong? David placed the letter on the table between them. Maggie's eyes scanned the words, and as she processed what she was reading, her face drained of color. Oh my God, she whispered, the shock evident in her voice. David, this can't be true. But it was. The letter outlined a series of illegal activities tied to Rick and Sandra's business dealings, fraud, money laundering, and even possible connections to organized crime. They had been involved in these things for years, using their charm and influence to hide it all under a veil of respectability. And Ryan, their son, had been too close to them, too trusting to see it. Maggie's hands shook as she pushed the letter away, her face a mixture of disbelief and fear. How could we not know? How could they hide this from us for so long? David's jaw clenched. They've been using Ryan, Maggie, manipulating him, making him believe that they were the only ones who cared about him, that I was the one holding him back. His voice shook with anger. They've had their claws in him for years, and now this. This is what it's come to. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to think. This changes everything. What are we supposed to do now? David felt a mix of rage and helplessness. He wanted to protect Ryan, wanted to shield him from the truth. But the longer this went on, the more he realized that protecting his son might mean showing him the painful reality of who Rick and Sandra really were. And that was a bitter pill to swallow. How could Ryan ever forgive him for this? But as much as David wanted to deny it, he knew what had to be done. The lies had to end. If there was any chance of saving his family, he needed to confront Rick and Sandra, now. The longer they let this go on, the worse it would be for everyone involved. Maggie, David said, his voice steady, I'm going to confront them. We can't let this continue. We can't let Ryan keep believing that they have his best interests at heart. Maggie shook her head, her voice filled with fear. David, are you sure? What if it makes things worse? What if we push him even further away? David stood up, pacing across the room, the weight of everything pressing down on him. I don't know, but if we don't act now, we could lose him for good. We've already lost so much. Maggie looked at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. And what if this is the final straw? What if it's too much for him to handle? David paused, looking back at her with a mixture of pain and determination. I don't know, but if we don't do something, if we just sit here and let Rick and Sandra continue to poison him, we're going to lose him anyway. We're already on the brink. We have to try. Maggie's shoulders sagged, and for a moment there was only silence between them, the weight of the truth too heavy to bear. I just don't know if we can fix this, she whispered, her voice breaking. David turned to face her, his heart aching for her, for Ryan, for everything they had lost. I don't know either, Maggie, but we have to try. We can't let this go on any longer. As the words hung in the air, David felt a strange sense of urgency. If they didn't confront Rick and Sandra soon, the damage might already be irreversible. His family was hanging by a thread, and it was up to him to cut through the lies, to break the hold Rick and Sandra had on Ryan. But as he prepared himself for the confrontation, a gnawing doubt settled in the pit of his stomach. Would it be enough? Would the truth even matter at this point? He didn't know, but he had to act. He had no choice. David and Maggie sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the weight of the conversation hanging thick between them. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her coffee mug, her eyes darting to David, then back to the floor. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, both lost in their own thoughts, both carrying the same heavy realization. This was their last chance. If they didn't act now, the damage would be irreparable. I don't know if this will even work, David, Maggie whispered, the doubt in her voice unmistakable. I mean, how do we confront them after everything, after all the years of lies? David's jaw tightened. He could feel his anger simmering just below the surface, barely contained. It has to be done. We can't let them keep poisoning Ryan's mind. We've let it go on for too long. Maggie nodded, her expression pained. I know, but what if it tears him apart? What if we lose him forever? David met her gaze, his eyes hard but filled with resolve. If we don't do this, Maggie, we'll lose him anyway. We're already losing him. At least this way, he'll have a chance to see the truth. It's the only way we'll ever have a shot at fixing this. They both stood up, the weight of their decision settling on their shoulders like a storm cloud. It was time. Time to confront Rick and Sandra, to put an end to the toxic influence they'd allowed to fester in their family. David's heart pounded as he drove to their house, the miles stretching ahead of him feeling heavier with each passing second. What would he say? How would they react? Would they even listen, or would they dismiss him as they always had? He didn't know, but he was determined to find out. Rick and Sandra's house loomed ahead, the familiar facade now something David found hard to look at. He parked the car, turned to Maggie, and for a moment neither of them moved. They both knew what was at stake here. "We're doing the right thing, right?" Maggie's voice cracked slightly as she turned to him, searching his face for some reassurance. David nodded, his gaze unwavering. "We are. This ends now, one way or another." Together they walked to the door and David knocked firmly, his pulse quickening. A few moments later Rick answered, a casual smile on his face that faltered the moment he saw the tension in their eyes. "David, Maggie, what's going on?" David didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk. Now it's about Ryan." Rick's smile faded entirely and he stepped aside to let them in. Sandra was sitting in the living room, as always, a cup of tea in her hand. She didn't look up immediately, but when she did, her expression shifted to one of mild curiosity. No sense of urgency, no understanding of the gravity of the situation. David didn't wait for an invitation. He dove straight into it. "We know what you've been doing," he said, his voice low but firm. "We know you've been manipulating Ryan, turning him against us. This has to stop." Sandra's eyebrows shot up, her voice laced with disbelief. "Manipulating him? David, that's a serious accusation. What are you talking about?" David's anger flared. "You've been planting seeds of doubt in his mind, feeding him lies about me, about Maggie. You've made him think that we're the problem, that we're holding him back. It's you two who have been poisoning his mind." Rick's face tightened and he stepped forward, his tone defensive. "You're out of line, David. We've always been here for Ryan. We've always looked out for him. You should be thanking us for being a support system when you couldn't be." David shook his head, a mix of fury and betrayal filling him. "Support system? You've been undermining everything I've done as a father, everything Maggie's done as a mother. This isn't about support, it's about control. And now look at the mess you've created." Maggie, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "David's right. I've seen it too. I've seen how you've subtly encouraged Ryan to distance himself from us. You've made him believe that you know better than we do, and it's tearing our family apart." Sandra's face flushed, but she refused to back down. "You're both imagining things. Ryan's a grown man. He's free to make his own decisions." David's frustration boiled over. "But he can't see what you're doing to him. You've turned him against his own family, and now he's too blind to see it." At that moment the door creaked open and Ryan walked in. His face was unreadable, his eyes flicking from David and Maggie to Rick and Sandra. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. David took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Ryan, we need to talk about everything. About what's been happening, about what they've been doing to you." Ryan's expression shifted, the tension in the room settling over him like a weight. "What are you talking about? What have they been doing to me?" His voice was sharp, defensive. He looked at Rick and Sandra, his parents, but they remained quiet, their eyes avoiding his. David pressed forward. "They've been manipulating you, Ryan. They've been feeding you lies about us. They've made you believe that you're better off siding with them. You need to see the truth before it's too late." Ryan's eyes flickered with confusion and anger. "No, that's not true. You're just trying to make them the bad guys. You've always had a problem with them." David felt his heart break a little more as he watched his son dig in his heels. "Ryan, I'm not trying to make them out to be the bad guys, but you need to see what they've been doing to you. You need to see how they've poisoned everything we've tried to build." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of David's words hanging in the air. Ryan stood there, caught between his parents and the in-laws who had become so integral to his life. He didn't know what to believe anymore, and for a moment, David saw something: fear. Fear of losing the only stability he had left. David's gaze locked onto Ryan's, and in that instant he knew that the next step wasn't in his hands. It was up to Ryan. Would he stay with the people who had been manipulating him, or would he finally face the truth? David could feel the choice coming, but he had no idea what the outcome would be. And that uncertainty cut deeper than anything else. David and Maggie sat in the living room, the silence between them thick, almost suffocating. Their eyes kept meeting, but neither knew what to say. The confrontation with Rick and Sandra had shaken them both, but it was Ryan's reaction, his confused, defensive silence, that lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. David's chest tightened as he replayed the moment Ryan walked out, the weight of the decision resting squarely on their son's shoulders. "What do you think he's going to do?" Maggie asked quietly, breaking the silence, her voice tinged with both hope and dread. David's eyes stayed fixed on the front door as though expecting Ryan to walk back through it at any moment. "I don't know, but I can't shake the feeling that he's torn. He doesn't know who to trust anymore. Not fully." His voice dropped as if admitting it aloud might make it more real. "And maybe he's afraid of losing everyone." Maggie let out a long breath, her eyes staring into the empty space in front of her. "I don't know what's worse, him choosing Rick and Sandra, or him staying stuck, not knowing where he belongs." David's heart ached as he watched Maggie. Her face was a mirror of his own turmoil, grief for the family they had lost, and an uncertain hope for what they could still salvage. He hated that it had come to this, that their son was caught in a battle between the family he had known his whole life and the in-laws who had quietly become a part of him. "Do you think he'll come back to us?" Maggie whispered, as though the question alone might break her. David shook his head slightly, the uncertainty weighing heavily on him. "I don't know, Maggie, I just don't know." Outside, the evening sky was beginning to darken, the orange and purple hues of the sunset reflecting the mood inside. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as they waited for Ryan to return. The minutes ticked by like hours, each one filled with the painful possibility that their son might never come back to them the way he once was. Ryan was torn. David knew it, but the guilt was eating at him too. He had tried to do everything right as a father, to be there when Ryan needed him, to give him space when he didn't. But somehow, somewhere along the way, things had broken, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't piece it all back together. David felt it, his own guilt too. Maybe he'd been too focused on work. Maybe he hadn't seen the distance growing between him and Ryan until it was too late. There were no simple answers. No way to undo the years of neglect, of emotional neglect, that had built up like a wall between them. The sound of the door opening broke David from his thoughts. He looked up to see Ryan standing in the doorway. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept in days. He looked smaller, more fragile than David had ever seen him. And yet he said nothing. Ryan didn't speak. He didn't offer an explanation for his absence, nor did he apologize. He simply stood there as if unsure of how to enter the space, unsure of his place in the house he'd once called home. David stood up slowly, his chest tight. He didn't know whether to speak, whether to confront him, or to let him come to them on his own terms. He looked at Maggie, who nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes full of the same uncertainty that consumed him. Ryan shuffled into the living room, sitting down on the couch without meeting anyone's eyes. For a long while, no one spoke. The tension was suffocating. Finally, Maggie's voice broke the silence. "Ryan, what happened? What did they say?" Ryan's eyes flickered with something, anger, confusion, maybe even guilt, but his lips stayed tight. "I don't want to talk about it," he muttered, almost too quietly to hear. David's frustration surged. He had been patient, but this was different. They couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. "Ryan, we're your parents. We have a right to know what's going on in your head." Ryan snapped his gaze at David, his face hardening. "No, you don't," he said, his voice shaky but angry. "You've never given me space to figure this out. You've been trying to control me my whole life, and now you think you can just barge in and tell me what to do. It's not that simple." David felt a rush of anger, but it was mixed with something else, pain, deep-rooted and raw. "I'm not trying to control you, Ryan. I'm trying to understand you. But right now, I don't even know who you are anymore. This isn't about control. It's about family." Ryan stood abruptly, pacing across the room. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted, his voice cracking. He paused, rubbing his face, exhaustion lining every inch of his posture. "I feel like I'm being torn in two." David watched him, his heart aching. This wasn't just about the in-laws or Rick and Sandra. It was about something deeper, something broken inside of Ryan. He wasn't just caught between two families. He was caught between two versions of himself, one shaped by the love and guidance of his parents, and the other by the lies and manipulation he didn't fully understand yet. "Ryan," David began, but his son turned away, cutting him off. "I need time," Ryan said, his voice low but firm. "I need to figure this out on my own." David nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I understand," he said quietly, though his heart was breaking. "But whatever you decide, know that we'll be here, whenever you're ready to talk." Ryan didn't look back as he left the room, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. David and Maggie exchanged a long, painful look. The moment they had been dreading had arrived. Ryan had to make a choice, one that would decide the future of their family. And as much as David wanted to believe that things would work out, the truth was clear. The choice wasn't his to make anymore. It was Ryan's. And no one knew which way he would go. Days passed in a heavy silence. The house, once filled with the noise of family dinners and the occasional laughter, now felt hollow. David moved through the rooms like a ghost, his steps echoing against the cold, empty spaces that used to feel so full of life. Ryan's absence was more than physical. It was a presence that hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, an emotional wall that neither David nor Maggie could break down. David tried to reach out, but each attempt seemed to push Ryan further away. The small moments of connection, the attempts at conversation, were met with short, clipped responses or, worse, complete silence. Ryan had stopped coming home regularly, preferring to stay with Rick and Sandra, the very people who had caused the rift in the first place. It felt like he was rejecting them, David and Maggie, more each day, as if being around them was too painful, too complicated. And David, with each passing day, felt more like an outsider in his own home. Sitting alone in the living room, David watched the clock tick away the hours. It was late, but he couldn't sleep. Maggie was in bed, her own tired eyes closed but filled with worry, no doubt reflecting the same turmoil he felt. David's mind was running in circles. Should he give Ryan more space, or should he confront him again? Every attempt to fix things had been met with rejection. And now, the silence spoke louder than any argument. He couldn't help but feel abandoned. The realization was like a weight in his chest, sinking deeper with every passing day. He had tried everything: patience, understanding, tough love, but nothing seemed to get through to Ryan. And now he was beginning to question himself. Was it time to give up? Had they done enough? Maggie's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but persistent. "David, you can't just give up on him. He's our son. He's confused, hurt, he needs you." David's eyes flickered toward Maggie, her face etched with concern. She had always been the one to hold on, to believe things could change. But even she seemed to be losing hope. He could see it in the way she moved through the house now, quieter, more withdrawn. Her frustration with Ryan's coldness had begun to show, though she still clung to the idea that he could come back, that their family could heal. "I don't know, Maggie," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried, but every time I reach out he pulls away more. What if he never comes back to us?" Maggie's eyes softened, but there was a tremor in her voice. "You can't just give up on him. You have to keep trying, David. He's our son. He's still in there. You have to believe that." David closed his eyes, rubbing his temples as the weight of the conversation pressed down on him. His own belief was starting to crack, the doubt creeping in, growing stronger each day. He had always thought he could fix things, but now he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Emily arrived, her presence a welcome distraction from the heavy silence that had consumed the house. She was the bridge between her father and brother, the one who tried to mediate when tensions were high. David knew she was only trying to help, but even she seemed worn down by Ryan's rejection. "Dad, I've been talking to Ryan," Emily said, sitting across from David at the kitchen table. "He's really struggling. He doesn't know what to do." David's gaze shifted to her, a flicker of hope lighting in his eyes. "What do you mean, struggling?" His voice was tight, defensive, as though any glimpse of Ryan's vulnerability might shatter him. "He doesn't want to hurt you, Dad," Emily said, her tone careful. "But he's caught between you and Rick and Sandra. He doesn't know where to turn. He feels like he's losing everything." David felt a pang of guilt stab through him. "I don't know what more I can do, Emily. Every time I try to talk to him, he shuts me out." Emily's face tightened. "I know, but he's hurt, Dad, and right now he's pushing everyone away because he doesn't know how to deal with it. He doesn't want to lose you, but he's scared of facing the truth. It's like he's afraid of the fallout." David sat back in his chair, the weight of his daughter's words sinking in. Ryan wasn't just angry, he was terrified. And that fear had manifested as rejection, as the walls he had built between them. David had been so focused on fixing the damage, on getting through to Ryan, that he hadn't seen the root of it: fear. "I've failed him," David muttered, almost to himself. "I've been so focused on making things right that I didn't see how much he's hurting." Emily reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his. "You haven't failed him, Dad, but he needs time. He needs to figure it out himself. And so do you." David looked at her, the uncertainty in his eyes slowly being replaced by something else, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, he couldn't fix everything right now. Maybe all he could do was give Ryan the space he needed and trust that, eventually, the walls would come down. That night David lay awake next to Maggie, the quiet of the room pressing in on him. "What if this is it?" he whispered. "What if this is the moment when everything falls apart? What if we can't get him back?" Maggie's voice was soft, barely a whisper in the dark. "We have to believe we can, David. We have to believe that if we hold on just a little longer, we'll find a way back to each other." David's heart ached, but he knew one thing: the choice wasn't his to make anymore. Ryan had to decide whether he would come back to them, or if the damage done was too deep to repair. The silence of the night seemed to answer him. The road ahead was unclear, and all David could do was wait for Ryan to find his way. The family, once so whole, was now dangling by the thinnest thread. Would they heal? Or would the distance between them grow too wide to ever close? David sat in his car, his fingers tapping restlessly on the steering wheel as he stared at the phone in his hand. The weight of everything, the failed conversations, the growing distance between him and his son, felt like it was suffocating him. Every time he thought he was getting closer to understanding Ryan, another wall went up, another door slammed shut. He had tried everything, or so it felt: tough love, patience, reasoning, but nothing seemed to break through. He was losing his son, and he didn't know how to stop it. Finally, after days of sleepless nights and restless thoughts, David called Victor. His longtime friend had always been a voice of reason, the one person David could turn to when the world around him seemed like it was falling apart. He needed guidance, something to keep him from spiraling deeper into despair. Victor picked up on the first ring, his familiar voice grounding David. "David, what's going on? You sound off." David exhaled deeply. "It's Ryan. I don't know what to do anymore, Vic. I've tried everything, but it's like I'm losing him for good. Every time I try to reach out, he pushes me away. I don't know how to fix this." There was a brief silence on the other end before Victor spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe it's time to stop trying to fix it, David." David's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Victor paused before continuing. "You've been fighting for Ryan's respect, trying to change his mind, trying to make him see things your way, but you've got to stop. You can't keep fighting for his approval. What you need to do is be there for him, no strings attached. Let him see you as a person, not a solution. Let him come to you when he's ready." David's mind raced. As he processed Victor's words, Let go of the fight. It sounded so simple, but it felt impossible. For years, David had been the one to fix things, to solve the problems. Letting go of that control was terrifying. But maybe, just maybe, Victor was right. I've been so focused on getting him to understand me, to fix what's broken, David murmured. But maybe I've been pushing him away more than I thought. Victor's voice softened. You can't keep imposing your feelings on him, David. Let him be where he is. And if he's ready to open up, you'll be there. Don't force it. Don't demand it. Just be present. No expectations. David's throat tightened. The weight of the advice settled in like a slow realization. Maybe this was the shift he needed. Maybe he had been too focused on his own hurt, on his own need for reconciliation, to see what Ryan actually needed. All right, David said quietly, a new sense of clarity slowly growing within him. I'll try. I'll meet him where he is. The next day, David found himself standing in the living room, his hands sweaty, his mind filled with doubt. He had spent the night reflecting on what Victor had said. It wasn't about fixing things right now. It was about showing up, about listening without judgment. Ryan had to feel seen, not just as a son, but as his own person. David had to stop trying to control the situation and simply be there. When Ryan walked in, David didn't immediately confront him like he had done so many times before. Instead, he just stood there, watching his son, who had once been a bright-eyed kid eager to share his day, but now stood with his shoulders hunched, his gaze avoiding his father's. David cleared his throat, his voice steady but not demanding. Ryan, can we talk? Ryan didn't meet his eyes. About what? David hesitated, then took a deep breath. I just want to listen. I want to hear what's been going on. I'm not here to fight or tell you what to do. I just want to know how you're feeling. Ryan's eyes flickered with a mix of suspicion and disbelief, but something in David's tone made him pause. For a long moment, Ryan stood there, arms crossed, clearly wrestling with himself. David waited, his heart in his throat, unsure of what would come next. Finally, Ryan spoke, his voice tight. I feel like I'm not enough, like I never have been. His words were laced with a deep pain that cut through David, and for the first time in what felt like years, Ryan's defenses started to crack. David blinked, the weight of those words settling on him like a blow. What do you mean? His voice was quieter now, filled with concern. Ryan's expression twisted, the anger melting into something more vulnerable. It's like I've always been trying to live up to your expectations, but I never could. No matter what I did, it was never enough. You always pushed me, always wanted more from me. And I couldn't keep up. I started to believe I was failing you. And then, when I was with Rick and Sandra, they made me feel like I wasn't the problem. It was you. David's chest tightened as he processed Ryan's words. For years, he had thought Ryan was just pulling away, being defiant. But now he realized it wasn't defiance. It was pain, born from feeling like he could never measure up. I didn't know, David said softly, his voice filled with regret. I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on you. I thought I was doing what was best, but I see now, I see how much it hurt. Ryan looked away, his emotions swirling as he struggled to keep his composure. It's too late, Dad. I don't know how to go back. It feels like too much now. David's heart ached, but he knew the truth in Ryan's words. He couldn't undo the years of miscommunication and missed opportunities. But he could start by listening now, by showing Ryan that he was there, not to fix him, but just to be there when he was ready. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of distance. It was the silence of something shifting, something that had been broken for so long finally being acknowledged. David knew they weren't done yet. This conversation had only just begun, and there was still so much more to say. But for the first time, he felt like the door was open, not to fixing everything, but to understanding. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of healing. Ryan's next words were uncertain, but they hung in the air like a glimmer of hope. Maybe we can talk more about this, if you're really listening. David nodded, his throat tight. "I'm here, Ryan, whenever you're ready." But as the weight of the moment settled in, David knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The question remained, was it too late for the healing to truly begin? Or had they finally reached the turning point that would lead them back to each other? Days passed after the fragile breakthrough between David and Ryan. They had shared words that felt like small victories, words that hinted at the possibility of healing. But every time David tried to approach his son, Ryan withdrew even further, retreating into the silence that had marked the beginning of their fracture. His responses became fewer, colder, and his presence in the house even more sparse. He would show up briefly, just to grab what he needed, then disappear again to spend more time with Rick and Sandra. David couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in his own home. Despite the raw conversation they had shared, Ryan had still not returned to them, in any real way. There was a profound sadness that came with that realization, a quiet grief that settled in David's chest. He had hoped for more, for a spark of connection, but it felt like every step forward only pushed Ryan 2 steps back. He sat on the edge of the couch late one night, staring at the empty space where Ryan usually sat during family dinners, now a ghostly absence. His fingers gripped the armrest, his thoughts a swirling mess of frustration, guilt, and longing. He had reached out with the best of intentions. He had tried to be there for Ryan, to listen, to understand, but nothing seemed to work. Ryan just wasn't ready, and David wasn't sure if he could wait forever. Maggie, though still hopeful, couldn't ignore the growing tension. She could feel it, too, the shift in their household, the way the silence stretched longer between them, the weight of Ryan's absence not just physically, but emotionally. It was as though the space between David and Ryan had grown too wide to bridge. And it wasn't just David's heart that was breaking. Maggie found herself questioning her own role in all of it. Sitting at the kitchen table one evening, she absent-mindedly stirred her tea, her thoughts heavy. "David," she began, her voice uncharacteristically quiet, "do you think I could have done more? Maybe if I'd stepped in sooner, if I hadn't been so caught up in everything, things would be different." David's gaze met hers, but his expression was distant, tired. He had heard her voice the question before, but it always felt like an unspoken weight between them. "Maggie," he said, his voice strained with exhaustion, "we've both tried. I've tried. But it's like he's building a wall, and every time I get close, he pulls away." Maggie wiped her eyes, a tear escaping despite her best efforts to hold it back. "I don't know if I can keep watching him drift away, watching you two drift apart." She paused, a sad, hollow look in her eyes. "And I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep pretending it'll all work out." David could feel the weight of her words settle on him, crushing his chest. He had thought they would survive this together, as a unit. But the truth was undeniable now. They were both on their own islands, surrounded by the emotional distance that neither of them knew how to close. Ryan had become the wedge between them, and it was threatening to crack their foundation. Emily, too, felt the divide. She had tried, so many times, to bring the family together, to get her brother and father to talk, to bridge the gap between them. But each time she intervened, it only seemed to push them further apart. The arguments grew more frequent, the tension thicker, and the attempts at reconciling felt more and more futile. She felt torn between her loyalty to both sides, unable to fix what had been broken without making it worse. The distance between Ryan and David grew, and so did the distance between Emily and everyone else. Sitting in her room late one night, Emily pulled her knees to her chest, her mind racing. "What if I'm the one making it worse?" she whispered to herself. She had tried to play peacemaker, to smooth over the rifts, but now she wasn't so sure she was doing more harm than good. The house had become a place of quiet battles and unspoken pain. There were no easy answers. She had no idea how to fix what had been broken. She didn't even know where to begin. Meanwhile, David continued to reach out to Ryan, hoping for any sign that his son was still willing to reconnect. But the distance between them only grew. Phone calls went unanswered, texts left unread, and the few moments they did share were filled with awkward silences and half-hearted attempts at small talk. Ryan's time was spent with Rick and Sandra, where David knew he felt less judged, less scrutinized. And every time Ryan walked out of the house, it felt like another nail in the coffin. Maggie watched all of this, her hopes slowly fading. The pressure on David grew with each passing day, and she could feel the emotional toll it was taking on him. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that things would work out, but the truth was, she didn't believe it anymore. The distance between David and Ryan had become too great. She couldn't see a way forward. And then, in a quiet moment one evening, David turned to Maggie, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Maggie. I don't know if I can keep fighting for a relationship, th. It feels like it's one-sided. I've tried, but I'm losing him, and I'm losing myself in the process." Maggie didn't answer immediately. She could see the depth of his pain, the weight of the years of emotional strain catching up to him. "I don't know either," she whispered, "but I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not." David's heart sank. The truth was finally out. They were at a crossroads and neither of them knew how to move forward. He had given everything to fix his relationship with Ryan, but now he wasn't sure there was anything left to salvage. The thought of losing his son was unbearable, but was it too late for them to find their way back to each other? The room was filled with the uncomfortable quiet of unspoken fears, as David and Maggie sat there, knowing that something had already broken beyond repair. The future was uncertain, and the rift between father and son seemed impossible to mend. But for now, all they could do was wait, and wonder if there was still a chance for healing, or if the distance between them had become insurmountable. David sat across from Maggie, the soft glow of the kitchen light casting long shadows over their faces. The house, usually filled with the subtle hum of life, was quiet, too quiet. They had just finished dinner, but neither of them seemed interested in the dishes, or anything else for that matter. Their conversation had begun and ended with Ryan. They had talked about his silence, his withdrawal, and their own feelings of helplessness. But there was something else, something more personal, simmering beneath the surface, that neither of them had addressed until now. Maggie shifted in her seat, her eyes avoiding David's for a moment before she finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "David, do you think? Maybe we've both been neglecting each other, too. All these years with Ryan and everything else, we've been so focused on fixing him. We never really thought about us." David felt the weight of her words sink into him. He had been so consumed by the conflict with Ryan, the sense of impending loss, that he hadn't stopped to consider the toll it had taken on his marriage. Years of tension, unspoken grievances, and the constant strain of trying to fix a broken relationship with his son had left little room for anything else. Maggie wasn't just carrying the weight of their family falling apart. She was carrying her own quiet pain, too. And so was he. "I've been so focused on trying to fix what's broken with Ryan," David said slowly, his voice thick with regret. "But I see it now, Maggie. I see how much we've both neglected each other. We've been so caught up in our son's battles that we've forgotten about our own. I thought I was doing everything I could, but in the process, I've lost sight of you." Maggie's eyes filled with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "It's not just you, David. I've been so focused on being strong for you, for Ryan, that I didn't see how much I was drowning too. I thought if we could fix things with him, everything would fall back into place. But now I see how much we've neglected our own emotional needs." David's throat tightened as he realized the depth of the distance that had grown between them. They had been living parallel lives, side by side, but never truly connecting. They had been two people fighting different battles, neither of them acknowledging the wounds they were both carrying. And now, their marriage was suffering because of it. Maggie wiped a tear from her cheek, taking a deep breath. "I think we need help, David. I think we need therapy. We can't help Ryan if we don't start healing ourselves first." David looked at her, his heart heavy with the truth of her words. She was right. If they didn't fix their own relationship, how could they ever hope to fix what had been broken with their son? The emotional toll of the last few months, hell, the last few years, had left them both fractured, and they couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. If they didn't confront their own issues, they would continue to fall further apart, just like their relationship with Ryan. "I agree," David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We can't help him if we're not whole ourselves. We need to take this step together or we'll lose everything." Maggie nodded, the weight of their decision sinking in. They were both scared, uncertain of what therapy would reveal, of what they would have to confront. But for the first time in a long time, David felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that could repair them, something that could finally help them all heal. Later that week, Ryan noticed the subtle changes in his parents. The tension in the air had lifted, replaced by a quiet resolve. There was a new openness between David and Maggie that hadn't been there before, a softness in their voices, a willingness to listen. Ryan, though still distant, couldn't ignore the shift. He didn't know what it meant, but it stirred something in him. A pang of guilt, sharp and sudden, coursed through him. He hadn't realized how much damage he had caused, not just to his relationship with his father, but to the entire family. He had been so caught up in his own hurt, his own anger, that he hadn't seen the cracks he was creating around him. And now, seeing his parents trying to rebuild, trying to heal, made him feel like an outsider in his own home. Emily noticed the change in Ryan almost immediately. She had always been the one to try to bring the family together, but lately, even her efforts had felt futile. Now, with her brother looking more introspective, she saw an opening. She reached out to him quietly, as she always did, finding him sitting alone in the living room. "Ryan," Emily began, her voice gentle, "I know you're upset, but you need to understand what Mom and Dad have been through, too. They've given everything for you, for us. They're hurting just like you are, but they're trying. They're trying to fix things. And I think you should, too." Ryan looked at her, the anger still simmering beneath the surface, but something in her words cut through. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I can." Emily sat down beside him, her voice filled with quiet encouragement. "It's not about fixing everything, Ryan. It's about trying. You've already made the first step by seeing what's broken. Now, you just have to decide if you're willing to heal with them." Ryan didn't respond right away, but the guilt lingered, pressing in on him, forcing him to confront the truth of what he had done. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way back, but that decision, that choice, was his alone. As the days passed, David and Maggie began therapy, taking the first step toward understanding each other better. But even as they worked through their own issues, they knew the path to healing was long and uncertain. The question was no longer whether they could fix their son. It was whether Ryan was ready to heal with them. And if not, would they be strong enough to face the possibility that their family might never be the same again? The house, once filled with constant tension and unspoken words, had begun to settle into an uneasy quiet. The therapy sessions David and Maggie had started had begun to show small signs of progress, but they both knew there was still a long road ahead. They had begun to find moments of connection again, their conversations less strained, their interactions more honest. But the divide that had grown between them and Ryan was still painfully wide. David felt it every day. The absence of his son's presence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Ryan had barely been home. When he was, the conversations were brief and cold if they happened at all. It was as if they were existing in separate worlds, both unwilling to fully face the other. David had come to understand that he couldn't rush the healing process, but every time he reached out to Ryan, whether it was a text, a conversation, or simply sitting in the same room, the distance only seemed to grow. It hurt deeply. He had spent years pouring everything into his family, into being the best father he could be. But now it felt like all of that effort had amounted to nothing. Ryan had become a stranger, a ghost that haunted the house he had once lived in. David's exhaustion was palpable. Every time he looked at Ryan, the old wounds resurfaced, fresh and raw, and it was hard to hide the hurt. But he kept trying. He kept reaching out, even when it felt like Ryan wasn't willing to meet him halfway. He tried to be there for him, to offer support, but it often felt like he was standing in the shadow of his own failure as a father. Maggie, meanwhile, was working through her own emotions in therapy. She could see how hard David was trying, and part of her was relieved that he hadn't given up, even when things seemed so hopeless. But she also couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on him. The emotional strain was starting to show in every part of their life together. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice when he spoke of Ryan. It wasn't just the frustration anymore, it was the weariness, the questioning. Had he done enough? Was it too late? Maggie herself was processing the guilt she felt for not stepping in sooner, for not seeing the signs of the rift between David and Ryan earlier. She was trying to be supportive of David's efforts, but it was clear that they both had a long way to go before the family would truly heal. And sometimes, she wondered if healing was even possible. Ryan, for his part, had been a silent presence in the house for months, wrestling with his own demons. The weight of everything he had put his parents through, the disrespect, the silence, the rejection, had started to sink in. But it wasn't that simple. Ryan couldn't just apologize and make it all better. He couldn't just erase the pain, and he didn't know where to begin. He had been so stubborn for so long, convinced that distancing himself was the answer. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he realized how much damage he had caused, not just to his relationship with his father, but to the family as a whole. One evening, after days of pacing around his thoughts, Ryan sat down in his room, his mind a storm of confusion and guilt. It hit him all at once. He had been disrespectful. He had pushed away the very people who cared about him most, all because he couldn't see beyond his own anger and pain. The realization was like a punch to the gut. But even now, he didn't know how to fix it. He had no idea how to undo the hurt, how to make things right. Emily, who had seen the turmoil in Ryan for months, knew it was time for him to face the truth. She had been the one trying to bridge the gap between Ryan and their parents, trying to offer a way for them to reconnect. But now, she understood that Ryan had to make the decision on his own, and it was time for him to hear the truth. "Ryan," Emily said one afternoon, finding him alone in the living room, "I know you've been hurting, but you need to face the fact that you've hurt them too. Mom and Dad have done everything for you, but you've been pushing them away. And if you don't do something now, you're going to lose them. You're going to lose us." Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his guilt rising to the surface. He didn't want to hear it, but somewhere inside he knew Emily was right. The weight of his actions was too much to ignore any longer. "I know," he whispered, "but I don't know how to fix it. I don't know where to start." Emily's voice softened, a plea in her tone. "Maybe you should try family therapy. It's the first step. It might help." Ryan shook his head, conflicted. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "I think you are," Emily said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you have to want to try." Ryan didn't respond immediately, and Emily knew that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. But she also knew that it was the first time in a long time that Ryan was allowing himself to hear the truth. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point. David, though still exhausted and worn down, realized that he couldn't keep pushing Ryan. He couldn't force him to heal faster than he was ready. So, he decided to take a step back. He would stop trying to make things right, stop pushing Ryan to talk, to reconnect. It wasn't about giving up. It was about giving Ryan the space he needed to come to terms with his actions in his own time. Maggie, seeing David's decision, knew it was the right choice. She encouraged him to be patient, to stop forcing the issue. Healing would take time. And Ryan had to find his own way through the pain. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but they couldn't keep forcing it. As David sat with Maggie later that night, he felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, letting go of the constant struggle was the first step in truly finding a way back to each other. But even as he took a deep breath, he knew one thing for certain: the family was still broken. The pieces weren't all there yet, and there was no telling if they would ever fully fit together again. But for the first time in a long time, David felt like he might be able to breathe again, even if the future remained uncertain. The road ahead was unclear, But David knew that the next step was in Ryan's hands. Would he choose to face the truth, or would the distance between them grow even further? David and Maggie stood in the living room, the weight of the past months hanging in the air between them. There had been no breakthroughs, no grand gestures of reconciliation, but there was something new, something fragile, a small flicker of hope. Ryan had agreed after much hesitation to attend a family therapy session. It was a step, however small, and it was the first time in months that David felt a glimmer of possibility. He couldn't help but be surprised. Ryan had resisted every attempt they made to bridge the gap, each one met with coldness and distance. But today, after Emily had spoken to him, Ryan had quietly agreed. The words were simple but heavy. "I'll go, but only because I want to try, even if I don't know how." It was a rare moment of vulnerability, a crack in the wall Ryan had built between them. For David and Maggie, it was a sign that maybe, just maybe, their son wasn't entirely lost to them. But as they drove to the therapist's office, David's stomach churned with anxiety. He didn't know what to expect. Was this really progress? Or was it just another attempt to placate them, another surface-level gesture that wouldn't go any deeper? They arrived at the office and waited in the sterile, uncomfortable lobby, the minutes dragging by. David stole a glance at Maggie, who sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly together. Her face was a mixture of hope and fear, the same look she wore every time they tried to reach Ryan. She didn't say it, but David knew she was wondering if this would be another wasted effort. Would Ryan really open up, or would it be another battle they couldn't win? When the door opened, the therapist greeted them with a professional warmth, guiding them into the session. Ryan followed reluctantly behind, his posture stiff, his arms crossed defensively. He hadn't spoken a word since getting in the car. David took a deep breath, trying to brace himself for what was to come. The therapist began with soft, open-ended questions, trying to create an atmosphere of comfort. But Ryan barely responded. His answers were short, dismissive, as if he had decided the session wasn't worth his time. He seemed to shrink further into himself with each passing minute, his reluctance palpable in the way he shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. David exchanged a glance with Maggie, both of them recognizing the familiar signs. Ryan wasn't ready to open up. He wasn't ready to let them in. The air was thick with tension, and every word seemed to fall flat, like they were speaking a language only half understood. Ryan's voice cut through the silence. "I don't know why I'm here. I don't need this," he muttered, his tone sharp with defiance. The therapist responded calmly, trying to diffuse the frustration. "I understand this feels uncomfortable, Ryan, but we're here to understand each other better, not to fix everything overnight." David's heart sank at Ryan's resistance. The years of silence, the walls Ryan had built between them, this wasn't just about a disagreement, it was years of emotional distance coming to a head. They couldn't just erase it. They couldn't force Ryan to open up, not when he wasn't ready. And yet, David still felt the pull of hope, the desperate belief that they could still fix this. Maggie placed a hand on David's knee, her gesture small but grounding. She was holding space for Ryan's pain, just as she had done for years. David, despite the hurt, followed her lead. They couldn't force Ryan to heal, but they could at least give him the space to do it on his own terms. After the session ended, the therapist suggested something unexpected. "I think it could be helpful if you take a break from the usual pressures of daily life. A family vacation, perhaps, away from everything that's been weighing you down. No distractions, no schedules, just time to reconnect." David and Maggie exchanged surprised glances. A vacation, could it really help? They hadn't been on a trip together in years, let alone under these strained circumstances. But the idea of being away without the daily grind, without the tension of their home life, there was a possibility in it. A small one, boo. It was something. Ryan didn't look convinced, his face unreadable as he shifted in his chair. "I don't know," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not really in the mood for family bonding." But there was a faint hesitation in his words, something that suggested he was thinking, even if he wasn't ready to commit. David knew better than to push him. So he let the silence sit, hoping that maybe, in time, Ryan would come around. Days later, after much back and forth, Ryan reluctantly agreed. He didn't say much, but his agreement, though reluctant, was still a victory of sorts. They booked the trip, a quiet cabin in the woods away from everything. No phones, no distractions, just them, alone with their thoughts. The trip was not without its moments of discomfort. Ryan still held a distance between them, his responses short, his expressions guarded. But something shifted during the quiet walks they took through the forest. Something about the simplicity of being together in nature, without the constant hum of their everyday lives, seemed to break through Ryan's defenses, little by little. One evening, after dinner, as the sun set over the horizon, David found himself walking alongside Ryan. The silence between them was different now, not suffocating, but full of the unspoken understanding that maybe, just maybe, they were both trying to heal. David didn't force the conversation. He simply walked, letting the moment unfold naturally. And then, as they reached a quiet clearing, Ryan spoke. "I've been an ass, Dad," Ryan admitted, his voice low but steady. "I've been pushing you away, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to be the son you want me to be." David stopped walking, his heart racing as he turned to face Ryan. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself, Ryan. I just want to understand you. I want to be here for you, no matter what." Ryan met his eyes for the first time in days, and in that moment something shifted between them. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't everything David had hoped for, but it was a beginning, a small step forward. As they walked back to the cabin, David felt a glimmer of hope, a tentative, fragile hope that maybe they could rebuild the bridge between them. It wasn't fixed yet, but it was a start. Ryan still had a long way to go. So did David. So did Maggie. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they had taken a step together, and that in itself was enough to hold on to. As the night settled around them, David couldn't shake the question. Would this moment, this fragile spark of hope, be enough to keep them moving forward? Or would the distance between father and son prove too wide to bridge? The days since their trip to the cabin had been quieter, more reflective, but the road to healing was anything but smooth. David and Ryan were making slow progress, inching toward each other, but every step forward seemed to come with a lingering moment of hesitation, a moment when the silence stretched too long and the past reared its ugly head. Ryan, though more open than before, still carried the weight of his unresolved anger and hurt, and David could feel it. The distance between them was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to pull them apart again. But for the first time in a long time, there was something different. They weren't stuck anymore. There was movement, however small. David continued to reach out, to offer his son a space to talk, to be heard without judgment. But the words weren't always easy to find, and sometimes, when the conversation veered too close to the heart of their issues, Ryan would retreat, shutting down just when they seemed to be making progress. It was as if the walls Ryan had built to protect himself were still strong, still keeping him from fully reconnecting with his family. But David didn't give up. He couldn't. He had seen what Ryan was capable of, the young man who had once trusted him, who had once looked up to him. That version of Ryan was still in there somewhere, and David was determined to reach him, even if it took time. Meanwhile, David and Maggie were working through their own challenges. Their marriage, which had weathered so much over the years, was now navigating the wreckage left behind by Ryan's emotional withdrawal. They had started therapy themselves, acknowledging that the strain of their son's behavior had driven wedges between them, too. Maggie, though still hopeful, was beginning to see that the healing process would take years, not just for Ryan, but for them as a couple as well. She hadn't realized how much they had neglected each other's emotional needs in the rush to manage everything else: work, family, their son's troubles. It wasn't just Ryan who needed to heal. Sitting on the couch after yet another long day of therapy, Maggie looked at David, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "You know, we're really doing this, right? We're actually trying." She shook her head, softly, as though the realization was still sinking in. David, rubbing his face, nodded. "We are, but it's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be easy." "No," Maggie agreed, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm glad you're not giving up. You've been trying so hard for Ryan, for us, even when it's been so painful." David looked at her, a twinge of guilt tightening his chest. He had been focused so much on saving his relationship with Ryan that he hadn't always given Maggie the attention and understanding she needed. "I haven't been easy on you either," he said quietly. "I've been so caught up in everything with Ryan that I didn't always see you." Maggie reached out, placing a hand over his. "We're both figuring it out. We're in this together. It's going to take time." David exhaled, a mixture of relief and uncertainty filling his chest. "Yeah, time." And so they moved forward, both in their own individual therapy and together as a couple, understanding that their healing would require patience, patience for themselves and for their son. There were still moments of tension, of unspoken hurt between them, but they had learned to hold space for each other's pain. The journey would be long, but for the first time in a while, David believed it could lead them to a place of true healing. Ryan, too, began to take steps on his own. With the encouragement of his parents, he started attending individual therapy. The process was slow and difficult. He struggled to open up, to confront the emotions he had buried for so long. The anger, the resentment, the feelings of inadequacy that had festered beneath the surface. They were all part of the puzzle, and Ryan was only beginning to piece them together. But at least now, he was trying. He wasn't just running away from his feelings anymore. David could see the change, however small. Ryan was quieter, more reflective. He no longer avoided eye contact or shut down entirely when David spoke to him. He was listening, sometimes, though reluctantly, but he was listening. And that, David knew, was a victory in itself. Still, there were moments when the old rifts showed. Ryan would still retreat, still isolate himself, still spend time with Rick and Sandra, the people who had offered him an escape from the complexity of his family. David knew this wasn't over. They were still in the early stages and the road ahead was uncertain. But the breakthrough, though fragile, was enough for David to cling to, a small flicker of hope that, with time, Ryan would come back to them. Emily, too, was walking a fine line between support and concern. She was caught in the middle, trying to help her brother understand the damage he had caused while still being there for him. Her heart broke for both of her parents and for Ryan, who seemed so lost. She had been the glue, the one trying to keep the family together, but even she knew that there were limits to what she could do. The dynamics in their home were fragile, always on the verge of either healing or breaking apart completely. One evening, after another difficult day, David sat down with Maggie, the weight of everything pressing on him. "I don't know if we'll ever be the family we were," he admitted. "But maybe we don't have to be. Maybe we just need to figure out how to build something new." Maggie nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "Whatever that new thing is, we'll build it together, one step at a time." David, though tired and unsure of what the future held, felt a glimmer of hope. The past couldn't be undone, but the future was still theirs to shape. And even though the road ahead was long, they had taken the first step toward rebuilding, toward healing, toward a family that was still struggling but not yet lost. But as he lay in bed that night, David couldn't shake the lingering question. Was the healing enough to restore what they had lost, or was their family destined to be forever fractured, with each small step forward feeling like a temporary reprieve? Ryan's transformation, though slow, was becoming tangible. It wasn't dramatic, not some sudden, miraculous shift, but it was real. Over the past few weeks, there had been moments, small moments, that David and Maggie held onto like fragile threads, moments when Ryan would look at them without that familiar hardness in his eyes, when he would listen instead of shutting down, when he would speak without the defensive walls that had once kept them all so far apart. It was still a struggle. Ryan would retreat often, his silence sometimes louder than any argument. He hadn't yet fully embraced the emotional vulnerability that David and Maggie so desperately needed, but they were learning to appreciate the small victories. One evening after dinner, Ryan had stayed at the table instead of heading straight to his room. He had joined them, a simple act that once seemed impossible. For a few minutes, they shared a conversation about their day. Nothing deep, nothing that touched the wounds between them, but it was enough. It was the first time in months that David didn't feel like an outsider in his own home. Later, Maggie had put her hand on his, and they both silently acknowledged the small step. They didn't speak of it, but they both knew. It was a victory. In that moment, they were a family, not just in name, but in spirit. But as much as David wanted to believe that things were better, that the worst was behind them, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be more setbacks, more moments when Ryan would pull away, more times when David would feel like he was losing him again. Still, they celebrated the small victories, a civil conversation, a moment of connection. The small acts of kindness Ryan had begun to show. It wasn't much, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was enough. One afternoon, as David sat in his office, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, surprised to see a message from Ryan. "Hey, Dad, I talked to Rick and Sandra. I told them I needed space. I'm gonna stay away from them for a while." David sat back in his chair, stunned by the message. Ryan had reached out, and not to him, but to them, to Rick and Sandra, the people who had subtly, for years, pushed him away from his family. The thought that Ryan was finally starting to distance himself from their toxic influence was a relief. But it was also bittersweet. The idea that Ryan had needed to go so far before realizing how much damage their influence had caused him made David's stomach churn. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that Ryan was taking responsibility, that he was making an effort to step away from what had been pulling him further from the family. It wasn't a solution, but it was a sign that Ryan was beginning to see what had been so harmful in his life. Maggie's reaction mirrored David's when he shared the message with her. Relief, cautious hope. "Maybe he's finally starting to see it," she whispered, staring at the screen. "Maybe he's starting to understand how much this family matters." David nodded, his throat tight. "Maybe, but we have to be patient, Maggie. He's still working through so much." And so they did. They kept moving forward with small moments of progress, each one building on the last. The strain of the past few years was still there, lurking under the surface, but David and Maggie were learning to live with it. They knew their family would never look the same as it once had, but that didn't mean it couldn't be strong again. Emily, who had watched the process unfold with a quiet hope of her own, began to see the changes in her family. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Her brother was starting to come around. Her parents were reconnecting. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fast, but it was real. She could feel it in the air when they were all together, the way the silence didn't have to be heavy, the way their conversations, though still tentative, didn't carry the same weight of unresolved tension. One evening, Emily sat down with David and Maggie, a soft smile on her face. "I've been watching all of you," she said, her voice almost shy, "and I just wanted to say I'm proud of you, proud of Ryan, proud of how far we've come." David felt a lump in his throat at her words, a sense of pride swelling inside him. Emily had always been the one to hold everything together, the one who kept trying to bring them back together. But now it seemed like they were finally moving in the right direction, and it was because they were all doing the work. He smiled back at her, a small but genuine smile. "We're not done yet, but I think we're finally getting somewhere." Maggie, too, felt the weight of the moment. She had been so afraid that they would never recover, that Ryan would never come back to them, that their family would never be whole again. But now, with each day that passed, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them yet. David, though exhausted, felt a sense of quiet pride in himself. It had been a long road. He had doubted himself at times, wondered if he could do enough to help his son, to heal his marriage, to rebuild his family. But now, looking at the small progress they had made, he realized something. Healing was not about a destination. It was a journey. A slow, painful, but ultimately hopeful journey. And with that understanding, David knew they had to keep going. The road ahead was still long. There would be more setbacks, more moments of frustration and pain, but they were walking it together, one step at a time. As David lay awake that night, his thoughts turned to Ryan, who was still a work in progress, still unsure of how to rebuild the trust between them. But for the first time, David believed that the gap between them might one day be closed. The question was, how long would it take, and how many more obstacles would they have to overcome before they could truly call themselves a family again? As the night stretched on, the uncertainty lingered, but there was something else now, a quiet hope that they might just make it through together. The sessions had been hard. At times, they felt like an endless cycle of trying to fix what was already broken. But over the past few weeks, something had started to shift in the family's therapy sessions. The atmosphere, once tense and laden with unspoken words, had become more cooperative, more open. It wasn't a dramatic change. There were still moments when the tension in the room was palpable, but it was a start. Ryan had begun to speak more, albeit reluctantly, revealing bits and pieces of the anger and frustration that had built up over the years. David could feel his own emotions rising, but he made an effort to sit back and listen. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the need to defend himself. He wasn't trying to justify his actions or explain away the mistakes he'd made. Instead, he focused entirely on Ryan, on understanding his son's perspective, even when it was painful to hear. Ryan's words cut deep, but David didn't interrupt. He let him speak, knowing that this was a pivotal moment. Ryan was finally starting to share the hurt he had been carrying for so long. Ryan's voice cracked as he talked about the times he had felt overshadowed, how he had always felt like his father's expectations were too high, too impossible to meet. "I wasn't good enough, no matter how hard I tried," Ryan confessed one afternoon, his eyes darting to the floor. "It wasn't just the things you said, Dad. It was the silence, too. Like you never really saw me, just the version of me you wanted me to be." David's chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain still. This was his son, and these were the words he needed to hear, no matter how much they hurt. His heart ached as Ryan continued to speak, describing the frustration of feeling unseen, unheard. It wasn't just about the moments they had fought. It was about the quiet accumulation of disappointment over the years. And now, finally, Ryan was admitting it out loud. David's voice was soft but steady when he responded. "I never meant to make you feel that way, Ryan. I see you now. I hear you now." Ryan nodded, though he didn't meet his father's eyes. There was still a wall, a quiet resistance that couldn't be fully broken yet. But David felt something shift just a little bit. His son had finally begun to see the depths of his own pain, and David was determined to show him that he wasn't the cause of it. They both had been shaped by the distance between them, by the silence, by the misunderstandings. But there was still time to rebuild. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but it was possible. Maggie, too, was learning to give herself permission to heal. After years of focusing entirely on their son, she was slowly finding time for herself and for David. There were still moments of tension, of quiet frustration, but they were learning to communicate again, to reconnect in small, quiet ways. They spent more evenings sitting together on the couch, watching shows they hadn't bothered with in years, or talking about the mundane details of their day. The deep conversations about Ryan were still there, of course, but it felt like they were beginning to rediscover the intimacy they had lost. They weren't where they had been, not by a long shot, but they were learning to live in the present, to build something new together. One evening, after a particularly draining session, David reached over and took Maggie's hand. The simple gesture felt like a lifeline. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I know I've been so focused on Ryan that I haven't given you the attention you need." Maggie squeezed his hand gently. "It's okay, David. I know you're trying. We're both trying." There was a quiet understanding between them now, something deeper than what they had shared before. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was theirs to rebuild, and that felt like enough for the moment. They had been broken, but they were healing together. Emily watched her parents and Ryan from the sidelines, silently observing the small shifts. She had always been the one to keep everything together, but now, for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. It wasn't that everything was fixed, that the wounds had been completely healed, but there was movement. There was progress. She saw it in Ryan, who had started taking responsibility for his actions. It wasn't easy for him. He still struggled to express his emotions, still found it difficult to apologize. But he was trying. And for Emily, that was everything. For years, she had feared that their family would fall apart irreparably. But now, she saw the possibility of something better, something whole, even if it wasn't quite there yet. Ryan's therapy sessions were showing small signs of progress too. He was beginning to take accountability for his actions, understanding the ways in which his behavior had hurt his parents. There were moments when he would sit in silence, reflecting on his past mistakes, and David could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to change, but the overwhelming fear of what that change might mean. The path forward wasn't clear for Ryan, but he was finally starting to see the steps he needed to take. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, Ryan sat down with David. "I've been a jerk, Dad," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I don't know how to fix everything, but I want to try." David's heart softened as he looked at his son. "You don't have to fix everything overnight, Ryan. We'll take it one step at a time." Ryan nodded, though it was clear he wasn't entirely convinced. But David could see the sincerity in his eyes, the first real sign that Ryan was willing to face the difficult work of repairing their relationship. The family was moving forward step by step, though the road was still long. They knew there would be setbacks, moments of doubt and frustration, but they were learning to face those moments together. The pain of the past wasn't something they could erase, but they could build a future where healing was possible, where the cracks in their foundation could be patched over with understanding, patience, and love. As David lay in bed that night, exhausted but hopeful, he understood something important. Healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And though it was difficult, though it was slow, they were walking it together. The question still lingered in David's mind. Would they ever fully heal? Or would the scars of the past always remain? Only time would tell, but for now they had made the choice to try. And that, at least, was enough. Ryan's change, though gradual, had begun to reveal something new, something David had been waiting for, and something Maggie hadn't dared hope for. It wasn't a grand, sweeping transformation, but there was a shift in Ryan's demeanor. He was quieter now, not retreating into himself like he used to, but still unsure of how to fully bridge the gap. And yet, as David watched his son, he could sense it. There was a glimmer of hope. One evening, as they sat together for dinner, just the three of them with Emily out with friends, Ryan looked at David and Maggie, his expression thoughtful but genuine. "I've been a jerk," he said, his voice low but steady. "I know I've hurt you both, and I don't know if I can ever make up for that, but I just want to say thank you for not giving up on me." The words were simple, but they carried weight, more than Ryan had ever offered before. David felt something shift in him, a subtle release of the tight knot that had been wound up in his chest for so long. Maggie's eyes softened as she met David's gaze. They had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if this moment would ever come. And here it was, small, quiet, but real. David didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached across the table and placed his hand on Ryan's. It was a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, of gratitude for this tentative step forward. "We've always been here for you, Ryan, and we always will be, no matter what." Ryan nodded, the guilt still etched on his face. I don't deserve it. You've done everything for me and I've been so damn stubborn. I know I pushed you both away. I didn't see how much it hurt." Maggie let out a shaky breath, her voice filled with tenderness. "You don't have to be perfect, Ryan. You don't have to fix everything overnight. We just need you to be here, with us." Ryan's eyes flickered with emotion, but he said nothing more. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time, David felt like they were truly beginning to rebuild, not just as father and son, but as a family. Though they still had moments of tension, the changes weren't just confined to Ryan. David and Maggie had been working on their own relationship, too. They had spent months in therapy, learning how to communicate again, how to reconnect after so many years of focusing on everything else. But now it was different. There were more quiet evenings together, more shared moments that felt real. They weren't pretending anymore. They were finding joy in the small victories, in the shared glance that said more than words ever could, in the laughter that no longer felt forced. One night as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, David turned to Maggie with a soft smile. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to where we were, but maybe that's okay." David nodded, his heart aching but filled with something deeper, understanding. Maybe it's not about going back. Maybe it's about finding something new. And so they did. The family, though scarred, was moving forward. Ryan's small steps toward healing, their own slow but steady reconnection, were creating a new foundation. It wasn't perfect, and it might never be. But David realized something important. They could still be whole again. It wouldn't look the same as it did before, but they could build something stronger from the pieces they still had. One day Ryan came to David with a quiet but serious expression. "I've been thinking. I reached out to some friends I used to hang out with, the ones I pushed away when things got rough with you guys." His voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. "I need to own up to how I treated them too. I've got a lot of apologies to make." David felt a swell of pride in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in years. "That's a good step, Ryan. It's not easy, but it's the right one." Ryan looked up at him, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't expect them to forgive me right away, but I need to try. I've hurt a lot of people, not just you and Mom. I need to fix it." Maggie, overhearing the conversation, placed her hand gently on Ryan's arm. "You don't have to fix everything at once, sweetheart. Just take it one step at a time. But I'm proud of you. You're doing the work. That's what matters." Ryan's shoulders relaxed slightly at her words, though he still carried the weight of his past mistakes. But there was something different in the air, a sense of collective determination, a belief that they could keep moving forward together. Emily, watching this all unfold, felt a cautious sense of hope rising in her heart. The family was changing slowly, but it was happening. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would be perfect or that the past could be fully erased. But there was progress, and for the first time in what felt like years, Emily allowed herself to believe that they might just make it. David, though tired, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not in the way things were, but in the way they were trying. In the way they were rebuilding, not just their family, but themselves. He had fought hard for this, for his family, for his son. And while it hadn't been easy, it was worth it. But as the family gathered together in the quiet moments that followed, David couldn't shake the question. Would this fragile hope hold? Or would the weight of the past eventually pull them all apart again? It was a quiet evening when Ryan finally stood in front of David and Maggie, the weight of the past heavy in his chest. They had come a long way. There had been moments of tension, anger, and silence, but now, as he stood there, he could feel the small victory in the air, the one they had all been working toward. "I'm sorry," Ryan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know I've hurt you both. I've said things I can't take back, and I've treated you like you didn't matter." He paused, looking down, as if the words he had carried for so long were finally spilling out. "But you've always been there for me. Even when I pushed you away, you didn't give up. And I don't deserve that, but I'm grateful for it." David's heart ached as he listened, a mix of relief and lingering pain filling him. This wasn't the first apology from Ryan, but it was the one that felt different. It was the one where Ryan truly saw the impact of his actions, the pain he had caused, and acknowledged the love and patience David and Maggie had shown H. It wasn't just words. It was a shift, a realization that Ryan was finally facing the depth of what had happened, and more importantly, what he had learned. Maggie's eyes softened as she watched Ryan, her hand instinctively reaching for David's. They had been through so much, and this moment, however small, felt like the beginning of something new, something that could be built on honesty, vulnerability, and understanding. David nodded slowly, the words forming in his chest but feeling difficult to say. "We've always been here for you, Ryan. We're not going anywhere. We're proud of you for facing your mistakes and for being willing to change." He took a breath, glancing at Maggie, who gave him a gentle nod. "We've all been through a lot, but I believe in you. We believe in you." Ryan's gaze shifted between them, the rawness of their forgiveness sinking in. It wasn't just about his apology, it was about the trust he was slowly rebuilding with them. He had a long road ahead, but this moment, right here, felt like the first solid step. Maggie smiled, a mix of relief and pride in her expression. "You don't have to be perfect, Ryan. You don't have to fix everything all at once. We just want you to keep moving forward. We're here for you every step of the way." The weight of those words hit Ryan like a wave. He had spent so long feeling like he was fighting a losing battle, like he could never be enough. But here, in this room with his parents, he was starting to see the possibility of something different. Maybe they could start again. Maybe they could rebuild what had been broken. The family sat down together, the awkwardness melting away as they shared a meal, simple, unremarkable, but also profound. For the first time in a long time, it felt like home. Not perfect, not easy, but real. They weren't erasing the past, but they were learning how to live with it, to acknowledge it and move forward. That night, as they sat together on the couch, Maggie and David exchanged a quiet look of gratitude. They had weathered the storm. They had fought for their son, fought for their marriage, and fought for their family. And now, though the road ahead was still uncertain, they knew something important. They were stronger together. The wounds they had endured hadn't torn them apart. They had reshaped them, rooted them deeper in the understanding that love, in all its complexities, was worth fighting for. Ryan, too, had begun to see that he couldn't undo his past mistakes, but he could honor the lessons he had learned. He was still on his journey, still figuring out who he wanted to be, but there was a quiet resolve in him now. He wasn't running anymore, not from his parents, not from himself. He was ready to take the steps that would allow him to live a life that reflected the love his parents had given him. Days turned into weeks, and the family began to rebuild old traditions, simple things like game nights, long walks, shared meals. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. They were creating new memories while acknowledging the ones that had come before. They weren't forgetting the pain, but they were learning to live with it, to use it as a foundation for something stronger. As David sat on the porch one evening looking at the stars with Maggie beside him, he realized something. He knew they weren't done yet. The journey ahead would still be filled with challenges. There would be more setbacks, more emotional hurdles to cross, but they had made it this far. And that, in itself, was a victory. The family, though scarred, was moving forward. They knew it wasn't a perfect path, but they were taking each step together, and that gave David a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. They had their scars, their wounds, but they were still standing. Together. The road to healing wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, David felt that glimmer of hope. The question that lingered, though, was how far they could truly go. Would they be able to heal completely, or would the past continue to haunt them? Only time would tell, but for now they were taking the next step, and that was enough. The reunion was small, intimate, a gathering of those who had weathered the storm and come out the other side. The years had passed, and the scars of the past, though still visible, had faded into something stronger. It was a warm summer afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the backyard where the family had gathered, no longer fragmented by silence and pain. David and Maggie sat side by side, their hands intertwined, their faces a picture of peace that had once seemed impossible. Ryan, now in his 30s, stood beside his wife and children, looking more like the man David had always hoped he would become. There was no longer the distance, no longer the walls that had once made him feel like a stranger in his own family. His eyes had softened, and his posture had changed. He stood tall, no longer weighed down by guilt or anger, but by the quiet pride of a man who had learned the hardest lessons life had to offer. And now he was standing in front of them, not just as their son, but as a father himself, trying to pass down the lessons he had learned. As the family settled into the evening, David couldn't help but reflect on the distance they had covered. Years ago, it had seemed impossible that they would reach this moment, the day when their family was whole again. He looked at Ryan, his chest swelling with pride. Ryan had worked hard to rebuild the trust that had been broken, and though it had taken years, David saw the change, the growth. David's voice was steady but full of emotion as he looked at his son. "I'm proud of you, Ryan. You've come so far. Watching you become the man you are today, it's more than I could have hoped for." Maggie's eyes glistened as she added, "We've been through so much, but seeing you here, seeing you with your family, it's the greatest gift we could ask for. You've shown us all what it means to grow, to forgive, and to keep going even when it feels like the weight is too much." Ryan's eyes welled up with emotion, but his voice was firm, sincere. "I don't know if I've told you enough, but I'm so grateful for everything you've done for me, for not giving up when I was so lost. You showed me what love really is. You taught me how to be a father, how to be there for my own kids in the way you were there for me, even when I didn't deserve it." David felt a lump form in his throat, his voice quiet when he responded, "We never gave up on you, Ryan, and you never gave up on us. That's what matters." Ryan nodded, his gaze lingering on his parents. "I think about that a lot, how much I've taken for granted, how much I've been given, and how much I didn't understand until I became a father myself." The family shared a moment of quiet understanding. Ryan's children played nearby, their laughter light and carefree. It was a sound David and Maggie hadn't heard in the house for years, a sound that once felt foreign to them but now felt like the soundtrack of their family's healing. Ryan was a father now, and David and Maggie, now grandparents, looked at their grandchildren with contentment in their hearts. They saw themselves in those little faces, the promise of a new beginning, the hope of a future where love and respect were the foundation. The evening went on, the conversations flowing easily as the family shared stories, memories, and dreams. But underneath the lightness of the evening, there was a deep sense of accomplishment, the recognition that this family had survived the hardest of tests and emerged stronger than ever before. As the night grew darker, the family gathered around the fire pit, the warmth of the flames flickering in the cool air. David looked around at everyone, Maggie, Ryan, his grandchildren, and Emily, who had always been the glue holding them together. There were moments of pain in the past that would never be fully erased, but they had learned to turn those moments into something powerful, something enduring. David took a deep breath, his voice soft but carrying the weight of the years. There were times when I thought we'd never get here. I thought we'd lost each other for good, but we made it. And that's what matters. It's not about how broken we were, it's about how we came back together." Maggie smiled, her hand resting on David's arm. "And how we've built something even stronger." Ryan, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke up. "I think it's because we learned how to forgive. We learned that it's not about being perfect. It's about loving each other even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible." The family nodded, understanding the depth of what he was saying. Forgiveness had been the key, the willingness to face the pain, to acknowledge the past, and then to move forward together, stronger than before. As the fire crackled in the background, David felt a sense of peace settle over him. Their family was no longer the fractured, broken group they had been. They were whole, not because they had erased the past, but because they had learned from it. They had built something new from the ashes. And as the stars filled the sky above them, David knew that their legacy was no longer defined by the struggles they had faced, but by the love, respect, and forgiveness they had fought so hard to cultivate. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they would face it together. The question lingered in David's mind. Would they continue to grow, to heal, to thrive? Or would the past continue to challenge them? But for tonight, for this moment, they were united. And that was enough.